In Afghanistan, nationalists tried to use the same methods of People's War to resist the very socialist ideas that had been fought for in Vietnam and Cuba. A remote and mountainous country, Afghanistan was wedged between Pakistan, Iran, and the Soviet Union. Its 15 million people cherished fierce tribal loyalties. In a deeply Islamic nation, society was almost feudal. In 1978, communists seized power in the capital, Kabul, and tried to impose a radical program that would turn a traditional society upside down. Many Afghans found the changes an offense to Islam. And after an uprising in the countryside, the Soviet Union sent in its own army. Because of the Cold War, they felt they couldn't let Afghan socialism fail. Soon, 100,000 Soviet troops were deployed. Like the Americans in Vietnam, they underestimated the enemy they faced. Afghan guerrillas were fighting not just to expel the Soviets, but to establish an Islamic fundamentalist state. They called themselves soldiers of God, Mujahideen, and believed they went to paradise if they died fighting the infidel. In the Panjshir Valley, one local commander knew the writings of Mao and Che. Although their politics were anathema, the same idea of peasant power made sense to Ahmed Shah Massoud.
Without mobilizing the people, it was impossible to fight against Afghan communists and against the Russians. We were, as they say, like fish in water, because when the people rally, the enemy doesn't have a chance.
The
communists were unbelievers and the Russians were invaders. Islam and the independence of Afghanistan were our main rallying cries.
The main Soviet base and the government were in Kabul. On the surface, they were in control, but it was hard to know who was really on whose side. The Mujahideen were infiltrating the city. Despite Islamic teaching on the role of women in the home, they were used in the Holy War as well. Mada Shawal's two sons had been killed by the communists. She agreed to smuggle weapons across the city.
Hidden under my clothes, tied to my body, I carried 2 Kalashnikovs to my rendezvous. I knew these guns were to be used against my fellow Afghans, but they were communists and they'd murdered my son. I was nervous because life is sweet and carrying guns in that way was terribly dangerous.
Mada Shawal was later arrested when government guards at a checkpoint found her carrying Mujahideen orders. She was imprisoned and tortured. Russian bombers and fighters brought massive firepower to bear, just as the Americans had in Vietnam. They destroyed villages and water wells to deprive the Mujahideen of any shelter. It was a scorched earth policy. Civilians were forced to leave the valleys and hide in the mountains, or join the trail of refugees out of the country. The journey across the mountains to the Pakistan or Iran frontiers could take weeks.
I came from Kabul last Wednesday because there was a lot of... Life is dangerous in Afghanistan. I have to escape from Afghanistan, our lovely country, to go to the Pakistan, to join with our brother and Muslim brother and get help from Pakistan.
Altogether 5 million, a third of the population, left. Huge camps grew up where the refugees struggled to come to terms with the traumas they'd lived through.
They shot my father 3 times, in his chest, his shoulder, and the back of his neck. He fell down dead. My brother and his commander got very angry and fought back. My brother jumped up and grabbed one of their weapons. More Russians came and cut all my brother's fingers off with a bayonet. So of course he was helpless. After his fingers had been cut off, they beat him. They shot him in one ear and the bullet came out the other.
As in Vietnam, the Soviets hoped their mobility and technology would ultimately triumph over the poorly armed Mujahideen. They too sent troops on search and destroy missions, hoping to catch the enemy by surprise. Young Soviet conscripts were mystified by the guerrillas' ability to vanish and then reappear, and they were terrified of being taken alive. Lieutenant Oleg Blotsky served 2 years as a platoon commander.
We soldiers were afraid of being captured because the Mujahideen would often torture us. The more experienced boys who had spent longer in Afghanistan used to carry a grenade with them. I carried one just here. There was a string attached. So if something dreadful happened, I could pull the string and it would all be over.
Like the Viet Cong, the guerrilla fighters were not self-sufficient. They depended on supplies from outside. A long route led over the mountains from Pakistan. Money and arms came from other Muslim countries and from the American CIA. In 1986, the balance shifted in the Mujahideen's favor when the pack trains brought in American Stinger missiles to shoot down helicopters and aircraft. The only way the Soviets could get provisions and petrol to their bases around the country was with armed convoys along mountain roads ideal for ambushes. As they drove through, they passed the wreckage of earlier runs and knew Mujahideen might be waiting to pick them off.
Once we hit an armoured vehicle with a rocket. It went straight through the vehicle and sliced through the heads of the two soldiers inside, a driver and a radio operator. They were killed outright and the tank was destroyed. Of course, I enjoyed killing Russians because they were the invaders. When we were blowing up their tanks and when they were dying, I was really happy.
Soviet casualties mounted. 15,000 were killed and 35,000 wounded in 10 years. The Soviet army's morale was sapped by the tenacity of the Mujahideen, and the resolve of the government in Moscow began to waver.
The sooner we could return home, the better. We all thought the same. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. I counted off the days before we left.
Finally, in 1989, a decision to withdraw was taken by the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. For the second time in 15 years, the guerrilla tactics of a people's army had succeeded against a far more powerful foe.
Strong motivation and belief in your own victory are the most important things in a guerrilla war. The other keys to victory are the proper use of terrain by guerrillas and the mobilization of the people.
Though the Mujahideen entered Kabul 3 years later, when the communist government fell, they were far from the peaceful Islamic state they talked of. The celebrations were premature. With their common enemy gone, rival Mujahideen groups now turned on each other. In the guerrilla wars that were fought with external help, victory and the withdrawal of the outsiders was seldom followed by an easy peace. At home, there were winners and losers. Many were driven abroad, and bitter hatreds and suspicions remained. The scars to whole societies would take a long time to heal.